Hello and welcome to today's Corporate Research Forum webinar on effective performance management. Joining me today are Jerry Ledford from the Centre for Effective Organisations in California and Hugh Mitchell, who's formerly Chief HR Officer for Royal Dutch Shell. For those of you who've attended previous webinars, you'll know that we like to keep these as interactive as possible. So please do submit your questions via the webinar feed or via Twitter. And also we will be running some polls throughout to get your opinions. So without further ado, I will let's start with our first poll. We'd like to hear your views on some of the new techniques that we're going to be discussing this morning around performance management. So question for the audience, if you can put in your responses, please. How many of the following techniques, so we're looking at ratingless appraisals, continuous feedback and crowdsourced feedback, how many of these have you adopted in your organisation? Is it none of the above? Is it only one or perhaps two or more? So we'll run the poll and we'll come back to discuss that in a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian, and good morning to everyone. We've got 45 minutes, I think, ahead of us, and what we're going to try and do is cover performance management from a few different angles. We'll start by basically asking Jerry to give us his perspectives on the latest thinking, the latest best practices in the field. We'll move on then to look at some of the kind of softer and cultural aspects of performance management, some of the important enablers. And then hopefully towards the end, we will get time to look at what are some of the pressures and strains and opportunities that we have going forward in this space. But before we kind of leap into that, maybe we should just, and I'm going to ask Jerry to kick off on this one, we should start with saying, what do we actually mean by performance management? Jerry.
Okay, great. So for those of you who've been around in the field for a while, you may remember that until about 25 years ago, we talked about performance appraisal and focused a lot on how to accurately rate performance and how to train managers so they could do that, and so forth and so on. And about 25 years ago, we decided that there were some broader purposes here that we should be focusing on, and named the activity as performance management. And so the intention was to make the whole process more strategic and better linked to other HR processes, such as succession planning and development and all the rest. And so the optimistic point of view would be that we made the transition and nomenclature as a way to signify a better set of purposes, broader set of more strategic purposes for the activity. The cynical point of view would be we were so terrible at performance appraisal that we had to invent some other sets of goals for the activity because we were going to do it whether it worked or not as an appraisal activity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the slide that we've got up in front of us, and I think the only bit that's missing for me is that all of this is designed to ensure that individual performance improvement, organizational performance improvement leads to better business outcomes for the organization. And that is indeed the core of this whole area, I think. So we've got the results of the poll, which hopefully you can see. Okay, but that's quite interesting. So basically it says, 50% of the population that's listening today are in this dialogue in one way, shape or form. So hopefully that will mean you'll have lots of questions that you can then push towards us, because we're happy to let this webinar go where the energy is in the audience. But back to you, Jerry, in terms of the research you've done, looking very much at best practice, what has emerged?
So the three that were part of our poll are clearly the activities or the types of techniques of performance management that are the hottest things today. So in studies that we've done of a large number of organizations with World at Work, we found that by far the most common of the three is ongoing feedback. So that would mean we've gone from an annual process to what had become a biannual process at some point 20, 30 years ago to a process that now happens at least 4 times a year, could be as often as monthly. And the idea is that the world is fast paced. Once a year is not enough. We need a process that keeps the supervisor talking frequently to a subordinate about what they're doing and how well they're meeting goals and what the goals should be as the business evolves, as well as how they can perform better. The second is ratingless performance appraisal. This is the darling of the media, so probably most of the articles that you'd see in the business press would be about ratingless performance appraisal. It has some very powerful and well-known proponents in the consulting world. The idea is that there is no letter or number grade for performance. You get text feedback. You get words that describe how well you're doing, but there is no summary grade. There are lots of wrinkles to how that's implemented, and in many companies, you have a grade, you just don't know it. But that is a very popular one as well. And then finally, the least popular of the three, but I think one that has a lot of long-term potential, is crowdsourced feedback. This is an evolution of what had been called 360 feedback 25 years ago and was widely adopted. Crowdsourced feedback says that the formal appraisal process is too cumbersome to ask people who are peers and others to complete. They don't know all the details about performance of an individual that they work with and a project team and so forth. But they may know a lot about how that person interacted in their experience with them. And so using electronic social media tools, sort of the Facebook for the company, you're able to give text feedback 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And then that can be collated periodically to give the supervisor an insight into the performance of the individual that they're reviewing from the point of view of other people that they work with.
I'm going to resist the desire to jump into ratingless performance reviews, and let's start with the ongoing feedback. I mean, of the companies that you looked at, I mean, my mind goes to one level. You can have some mechanism that actually says each time the feedback happens, it's recorded, it's lumped into some HR, IT system, so you have proof, if you like, that you're having that.
Right.
Is one methodology. And at the other extreme, presumably, you can also, through employee surveys, ask individuals whether they are actually getting the experience that the companies are espousing they should receive. What's the kind of mix on that continuum?
Yeah, so it's really all over the place. So you have a company like Adobe Systems, which has worked very hard to take HR completely out of the system, and there is basically no oversight of individual supervisors anymore, other than whatever their managers may provide. And so they claim to have saved 100,000 management hours a year by getting HR out of their hair and not recording what happened and how many conversations there were and so forth. There are just pay decisions made once a year. In other companies, it's actually become very easy to monitor by modern HR technologies. And so if you have Workday or SAP SuccessFactors or any of the others, logging the fact that a review took place and some brief description of what was discussed and what was found is very easy to do and not particularly time consuming, and often quite revealing about whether or not these conversations are taking place. So personally, I prefer some level of oversight, and I think it's important for HR to be involved and to know whether conversations are taking place and how well they're happening. So the latter is more my preference, but there is certainly a mix out there.
Okay. And on the crowdsourced performance feedback, my mind cannot help but go to the political sphere,
Yes.
where in a sense you see a lot of political leaders in different parts of the world very much appealing, if you like, to social media and populism that can arise from that. I mean, how do you overcome some of those dangers and challenges in
Yes.
this type of approach?
So it's a very good question. And in fact, we have tried for years to get some of the vendors who do this kind of work to sponsor some research to find out the answers to questions like that. Is it just a popularity contest? If I give you positive feedback, do you feel obligated to give me positive feedback, and so forth? And I don't think there's a lot of data that says one way or the other. I would like to know the answers to those questions myself. On the other hand, social media is so much a part of the water these days, and particularly younger people, but even people as old as us, are on Facebook or LinkedIn or other social media all the time, and it's very easy to do. The advantage to using the social media approach is that it really gets people to say something when they have something to say. You're not forcing the activity of getting people to fill out forms full of all kinds of questions they can't answer anyway. And so I think the positive spin on this, or the situation in which it can be valuable, is if the supervisor is looking at the feedback that's provided from others and finds that someone who they thought wasn't a particularly good performer continually gets very good feedback from others. And that may lead them to rethink how well that person is performing. Or conversely, someone that they thought was a superstar, no one ever has a good word to say about them. How does the supervisor, reconcile those points of view, and how does one set of feedback inform the ratings and the judgment of how well the person's doing? There's not a lot of data on that, but we could imagine that it might be a positive set of information to have available.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I certainly know from my own executive time using, if you like, employee views through social media, through employee surveys, was quite commonly used in selection processes. So as a piece of contextual information, which leaderships would look at before appointing people to say, is there anything in there we need to more deeply understand? But that was slightly different from saying, unless you have a score of X, you won't do the job type of thing. Let's move to the kind of ratingless one. And I would have to declare a slight cynicism personally on this space. You said in your introduction that people don't use ratings, but they use language. And to me, if you use language like poor, good, very good and outstanding, then that sounds a little bit like a rating to me.
Yes.
And I think it links a little bit to the whole sense of a mechanism in how you look at performance across a population, with an objective that ultimately you will have to differentiate reward to that population.
Yes.
And the mechanisms that flow through that process. And indeed, we have one question which is saying, what's your views on forced distribution, which in a sense is an outcome of a ratinged performance appraisal system. So your comments, Jerry.
So I am firmly schizophrenic about ratingless appraisal. Part of me thinks it's a great idea, and part of me thinks it's a disaster. So the positives first. I am completely sympathetic with the idea that if we want supervisors and subordinates to discuss performance, they ought to talk about performance and consequences that follow from it, such as promotion, pay increase, bonus, and so forth, and talk about those things directly, and not talk about whether you're a 3.8 or a 3.9 on a 5-point scale. And so you get more to the heart of the matter if you're not having the crutch of the scale. And also you force the supervisor to actually provide some commentary that may be useful beyond just giving the rating judgment and then walking away. So on the other hand, we know that in implementation, companies often have ratings without the ratings. So an incredible number of companies in the World at Work study that had rating lists actually kept shadow ratings in the background. And so therefore, it's just a process that's not very open. There is a rating. The employee just doesn't know what it is. And it governs decision-making about consequences of the appraisal, just as if there were a rating. And there are even something like 20% of the companies in our sample that had stacked ranking. How the heck can you have ratingless appraisal and stacked ranking? So processes are going on in the background that may gut the value of something that's ratingless. We've done 2 studies that looked at whether or not there was an effect. And one of those was negative and one was more encouraging. The negative one was a study in an insurance company in which we looked at, we had a quasi-experimental design. We had before and after data in parts of the organization that went ratingless and parts that continued on with the existing process. Now, they had a very good existing performance management process with some of the highest scores that we've ever seen in ratings by employees on, for example, the process being useful, the process giving them good feedback, and so forth. And they were already doing a lot of things well. For example, the average employee already was receiving continuous feedback. They had, on average, 7 conversations with their subordinate. Now, the before and after data indicated there's absolutely no advantage of ratingless in that situation. You couldn't detect any difference between the experimental and control groups. And so therefore we'd say not a very big success. The company may or may not end the experiments. They're thinking about that. So far, they've continued them because there's no harm, and the departments that do them like them. But they're a little bit taken aback by how little evidence there is that it's an advantage in any way. The positive study that we did, and we'll talk more about this later, looked at the effect of rating lists as well as a number of other performance management techniques, and then the broader culture of the organization around feedback on outcomes such as net profit margin and different rates of return. And there we actually found that rating lists was the only performance management technique that had any direct impact on financial performance, and it had reasonably strong impacts. The impact was not as strong as culture, a topic we'll talk more about in a bit. But there was an effect. And so that's the part of me that says maybe there's something there. I think what's happening in those cases is companies are abandoning performance management in many instances by going ratingless. It's like the companies that wash their hand of having HR involved or having much oversight, and this is just a private activity now between supervisor and subordinate, and one that's greatly de-emphasized. And so they're gaining advantages by just doing less. If you think there's value in performance management or potential value, as I think there is, that's not the way I would go if it's my company. But I can see the evidence that in some cases it's advantageous.
Okay, no, thanks. We have a few questions. I think one of them plays very much to the earlier conversation about this isn't about, in a sense, an abstract process of just an interest in how somebody performed in a given year. It's actually about trying to raise the performance level of an individual and then collectively of a group of employees to have an outcome for the business. So is there the whole kind of rating, how does it play into that more strategic debate about actually driving performance improvement as opposed to just having a conversation about performance?
Yes. So there are a number of things that have to happen for it to be a good performance conversation. So one is there has to be a discussion of what the goals or objectives are of the performance. And so there's a whole lot of literature about how to set goals that are meaningful and so forth, and indications that those are important in guiding performance. So I think what you're getting at is these techniques are not standalone. They're in a context of a set of other techniques that matter a lot for whether or not they're going to pay off. And so what does the reward system look like that is the consequence of the kind of rating that you get? That has a lot to do with whether the whole rating activity is worthwhile to begin with. You can have a reward system that undermines the objectives of the company rather than helping it. And in that case, better assessing a bad performance badly is not going to be advantageous. So the nested context is important. One of the things that we found in the World at Work study that's interesting is that these different practices that are cutting edge seem to be complementary, and companies that did more than one of them did better. And so, for example, if you're going to go away with ratings, you'd like to have more conversations, just so people have a better sense of where they stand and what they need to do better. Crowdsourced feedback is complementary because it gives data outside just the supervisor-subordinate relationship, which in modern team-based organizations can be very important. So, so clearly having the right set for a given organization is very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the elements that plays in my mind is, and many organizations do that, is the actual performance review is ratingless, because it's essentially what you describe. It's a conversation between two people about performance against a set of targets.
Right.
Where the rating comes in is when subsequently that individual, along with a whole lot of other individuals, in a sense, have to compete for the pot of money that's available to be distributed. And then, if you like, choices are made. And again, that depends on the company, whether they have wide differentiation or narrow differentiation. But that ends up having, and even if you give it no rating, there will be a rating, because one person will get X% and someone will get Y%. So by definition.
It's inferable.
It's variable. So, and of course, that's always the challenge, is how do you, because you can end up with a whole team of outstanding performers, but at the end of the day, somebody gets the top money and somebody gets the lowest money, and that challenge. One last comment that somebody's asked, just 360 crowdsourced feedback, different, same.
Yeah, so crowdsourced is an evolution of 360. So I used to have to do 360 appraisals for other people at USC, and I'd be given the same performance appraisal that their boss got, and I'd be asked to indicate whether they were trustworthy, courteous, kind, and so forth, and whether they'd met all these performance goals that I knew nothing about. And it was inappropriate. I had no way of knowing how to fill out that form for most of the people that I was asked to fill it out for. They'd get their roll call of people that they'd hope to get good ratings from that would help them. Crowdsourced has two differences from that. One is that it uses social media technology, so it's much more real time. It's not driven by an annual process in the same way. And the other is that it's just text. So you can get people making comments that are very relevant to what they know, not to 16 rating factors that are in the performance appraisal form that they may have no window into.
Let's shift tact a bit. We've talked a little bit about mostly processes and systems and so on. Let's talk a little bit about the context that makes them successful. So the environment of the company, the culture, the softer elements.
Yes.
I know your research leaned heavily into that space as well, Jerry.
We got interested in this topic from working with companies over the years, and we kept noticing that companies that had a strong performance feedback culture, in which the message got through to supervisors and managers that if you're going to be somebody who's good at your job, you have good, honest, regular feedback with your subordinates. You tell them where they stand. You help them understand how they can perform better. And in fact, if you can't do that, you're not going to stay in the job. those kind of companies always seem to have good performance management processes, even if they had antiquated bells and whistles. So they had old software, they had bad rating forms that might even be legally invalid, but they spent all their time